is Smithfield. Today, of course, it's famous as a meat market, but 600 years ago it literally was a field just outside London. Then, on the 15th of June 1381, it became the stage for one of the most significant events in British history, the climax of an extraordinary fortnight that saw ordinary British working men and women rise up and claim their own place in history for the very first time. It was called the Peasants' Revolt, an event that saw people daring to challenge the rigid rules of medieval society. To rebel in 14th century Britain was to risk everything, and with the stakes so high, this tale involves scenes more bloody than the market's seen ever since. The 14th century has been called the world's worst century. It was a terrible time to live. On top of plague, famine and continual wars, there was oppression from the harshest of regimes. When they could bear it no more, the people's response shook the nation to its core. The Peasants' Revolt wasn't a riot, it was a revolution. Its impact was so shocking that historians from the ruling class deliberately hushed up its true significance. They hid the achievements of ordinary people by scorning them as rioting yokels. I want to restore the men and women who stood here to their rightful place in history. I want to bring a whole cast of unknown heroes blinking into the limelight. And with the help of experts, I want to show how oppressed people organised to transform their world and how betrayal and tragedy shattered that dream. Uncovering the truth about the Peasants' Revolt means embarking on an epic journey of discovery.
What the peasants did in 1381 does echo down the centuries to us, and it does have a resonance in terms of our own experience today.
It's the most important event in the social history of the English Middle Ages.
It set the pattern for later centuries of revolt.
In retracing the course of the revolution, I'll be finding out just who some of these extraordinary men and women were, and how exactly they managed the planning and logistics of their remarkable campaign. What they never told me at school was that it all started where I come from. I'm an Essex boy, me. When I was growing up here in the 1950s, already there was ribbon development virtually from East Ham to Southend-on-Sea, but it was very different in the Middle Ages. All the places that I knew in my childhood, Walthamstow and Woodford and Barking and Brentwood, they were just little villages. And I'm rather proud to say that it was the men and women of those villages who masterminded and led the Peasants' Revolt. Politicians today talk about the fight for the hearts and minds of Essex man. Well, in 1381, they definitely lost it. The politicians of the time were taking, as they now say around here, a diabolical liberty. It was May 1381, and the English had been clobbered by a new tax. The 100 Years' War with the French was dragging on, and it was really expensive. So in order to pay for it, they brought in a poll tax, which meant that every adult in the country had to pay the same amount, whether they were the 14th century equivalent of a Jag owner or the proud possessor of a Ford Fiesta. Margaret Thatcher's community charge was nicknamed the poll tax because it was based on the same principle, and 600 years later, it still didn't seem fair. But it wasn't the tax itself that started the revolt. At first, people seemed to be paying. The trouble began when the government did its sums. There was a shortfall. All over the country, people had been dodging the new tax by dropping off the official registers. In Essex, over a third of the population disappeared. If the authorities had turned a blind eye to the tax evasion, then the problem could have been avoided, but they decided to send commissioners in to chase up the defaulters. And what really sent people over the edge was the brutal, deeply personal way that these commissioners behaved. They'd go into a village and really start chucking their weight about. What caused most offence was the way they treated village women. These tax officials would stick their hands up young women's skirts to find out if they were virgins or if they were married and therefore eligible to pay the poll tax. The peasants' revolt was sparked by this kind of outrageous behaviour. And the man who put a stop to all this was a baker, Thomas Baker, from the village of Fobbing on the Essex coast. What we know about Thomas Baker was that he was brave. The chronicles say that no one dared to make the first move for fear that they would suffer irrevocable harm. But Thomas Baker had the courage to organise a deputation from surrounding villages and confront the commissioner at Brentwood. The commissioner's name was John Bampton. On the 30th of May, he pitched up at Brentwood with only a token bodyguard, blissfully unaware of what lay in store. Bampton set up a makeshift table in the middle of the village, and all round him there were angry people jostling, lots of people from the surrounding villages. It was a really ugly mood, and out of it stepped Thomas Baker, and he said to Bampton, "All of these folk have already paid their taxes. There's no way you're going to get a penny more out of them." And Bampton immediately ordered the arrest of 100 people in the crowd. That certainly wasn't going to happen. He'd completely misjudged their mood. A riot started and Bampton's men had to flee before they were beaten up. No one knew it at the time, but that was the start of the peasants' revolt. And it was a baker that started it. I'd never even thought of bakers as peasants, but Thomas the Baker had a very firm place in a social order that had been fixed for centuries. And to understand the peasants' revolt, you have to know where everyone stood in the pecking order. No, you're right, this isn't rural Essex. I've driven all the way down from Brentwood to Penarth in South Wales, down the M4, which is a heck of a drive, I can tell you, in order to see if I could get something of a feel of what medieval Barking and Billericay and Dagenham would have been like at this reconstructed village. To our untutored eyes, these buildings all seem pretty much the same, even though that's a barn, that belongs to the pigman, this one over here is the baker's house. Thomas Baker would probably have lived somewhere like this, but they all knew what their place was in this very close-knit hierarchy. For instance, inside the baker's house, it all looks pretty impoverished. In fact, the baker had got all he needed to survive. What made his life a misery was that he was officially a serf. He could own land and property, but he still belonged to the lord of the manor. Serfdom meant he couldn't move or work for anyone else, or even marry his daughter off without permission. Even the top man in the village, the reeve, was bound by the same system. He had plenty of space, lots of possessions, nice furniture, a few acres to farm. He was like a successful small businessman, but he was still thought of as a peasant because he was under the control of the lord of the manor. Nevertheless, everything ticked along quite nicely as long as there was plenty of food on the table. But then, in the middle of the 14th century, something happened that changed all that. In 1348, the Black Death swept into Britain. There was no cure. Communities such as these were devastated. The Black Death killed up to half of all the people in Europe. To put that into some kind of context, we all know of someone who was killed in the First or Second World War. But if you add up all the people killed in the World Wars, in Bosnia, in the civilian massacres of Hitler and Stalin, it still only comes to 3.7% of the European population. If you wanted to duplicate the effect of the Black Death on Europe, you'd have to have 20 world wars.
Well, in many ways, the Black Death was a disaster for many peasant communities. Lots of village communities were completely destroyed, whole communities were obliterated. And the Black Death is seen as a kind of punishment visited by God on mankind for its sinfulness. But if you